Good evening, church. That's been a while since I've been here, hasn't it? Try that again. Good evening, church. Well, good evening. It is good to see you. It is good to be back at Valdosta again. It's been a while, but we've always enjoyed our time here. We appreciate you having us back again and look forward to it. And I really appreciate those kind words, Brother Ed. Good to have him and his sister Faye back. I'm sure our folks are good folks are hard to find, I should say. Not your hard folks, but good folks are hard to find. And they're glad that you're back again. You know, you better be careful because you're getting close to Social Security age, and so it may be that he's thinking about, checking out most anytime. No, anyway, I'm teasing about that, of course, but it's always good to be with him, and I appreciate those kind words. I don't believe all of them, but I appreciate them anyway, and I really appreciate him and them and the good work that they do, and I appreciate all of you. It's good to be back again. If you haven't heard me before, just remember that I was not originally the original scheduled speaker for tonight, so if you don't like it, you can just pinch it or anyway, all right? So no pressure on me. Tonight we are going to talk about serving for just a little while. Serve. And as we think about serving, I want us to do three different things. First of all, I want us to begin by defining serving, what the Bible says about serving, so that we have a good foundation to start with. Secondly, I want to think about some of the characteristics of a good, true servant. And then number three, we'll hopefully have a little time to talk about some examples in the Bible of those that really exemplify service. So let's begin talking about service here tonight, just as soon as I get my mind on. How was that? All right. Ooh, sound a little hot, but that's all right. I'm sure they'll fix me up back there. Serving. In the Bible, there are two words in particular in the Greek that are interesting words that are very helpful when we think about defining what service is all about. The first one actually comes from the word of deacon, or at least that root word of deacon, and it really means to render service. And it means anything of kind of actness, the act of kindness that we would show towards someone or something. And that's a very good thing because that's pretty well what we would think about serving. The second word comes from a word that we know in the Bible as slave. Doulos is the word, doulo is the word that is used here. When we think about serving, it means that we are to serve towards something. And it really has an idea of one that is a slave that is serving. And that's a good definition because we know that slaves serve. As we think about that tonight, it's important that we think about how we serve and that we do exactly what the Lord wants us to do because obviously serving is an integral part of Christianity. Here are three things that we need to know about serving right off the bat. Number one, it is an action. It's not just verbal. It's not to say, well, I can do this and I can do that. Well, that's great, but we need to do it. So it is an action. It kind of reminds me of what James asked. He said, what is faith without works? How can a man say that I got faith and doesn't have works? And if we think about the serving in that aspect, that is certainly true. Well, it's not only an action, but it's also an action that is motivated by an attitude of love. In 1 Corinthians 13, in verse 3, we learn that though we give our bodies to be burned, and though we give everything that we've got to the poor, but we do not have love, then really we haven't accomplished anything. So there is service, but it's not just something that we do that pleases God, but it's something, if we want to be pleasing to God, not only do we do it, but it has to be an attitude that is motivated by love. And then number three, we learn also it is an attribute of Christianity. In Galatians 5 and verse 13, we learn through love we serve one another. We can talk about that in different ways, but let's take a moment just to think about individual serving, and then maybe even more so as we think about a church that serves. Through the years, there have been a couple of things that stand out in my mind that I have heard about serving that really makes me think, especially when it comes to from the standpoint of the church. Up at the Reed Hardeman lectureships many years ago, I was listening to Willard Collins, and he made a statement that has challenged me then, and it continues to challenge me even now. And he said, let's suppose the church where you worship, of course he's there in a lectureship, and we'll just say tonight the church at Valdosta. Tonight, let's suppose, and God forbid that this would ever happen, but let's suppose that when we leave here tonight, we lock the doors and say, that's it. We're not going to worship anymore. We're not going to be a church at Valdosta anymore. We're through. We're not going to worship anymore. Of course, that would be tragic. And again, I would say, I would pray that that would never happen. But here's the next part of the challenge of that. If that were to happen, how would it affect this community? Would they miss us? Would they say that that's a terrible thing that's happened because they're people that reach out to others? They're shining light in this community. And I would think that surely that is the case, but I think that we need to ask ourselves that tonight if that were to happen. On the other hand, when we think about that individually, if tonight you decided that, I'm just through, and God forbid that would happen too. But tonight, if you as an individual would say, I'm not going to be a part of the church anymore, and you were to walk away, how would that affect the congregation? Would they say that's a terrible loss, not only of a soul, but that's a terrible loss because he or she always has been very involved. They'll do whatever you ask them to do. They want to do whatever they can, always have, and been such an integral part of this church. Is that what they would say about you and about me? If this church no longer existed, how would it affect this community? That says something about our service and how we reach out to others. The second thing that I would say that challenged me that I've heard in years gone by is that we don't always serve, or do we always serve everyone equally? James 2 talks about that, remember? If there's somebody comes into your assembly and he has the fine apparel and the gold rings and he's one that you think, that guy must be important. He must have money. And you tell him to come up and sit in a good place, but there's another guy that comes in that doesn't have anything. He got on the dirty clothes and you tell him, why don't you sit off the back somewhere? Do we serve everyone equally? If you think about Jesus and what he did, think about him when he washed feet. I think that when he was in the upper room and he was washing the feet of his disciples, that he washed the feet of Peter just as gingerly as he did the others, even though he knew that Peter was going to deny him. He also washed the feet of Judas, just as gingerly as he would have washed anybody else's feet. Now, I have to say, if I'd been there knowing what Judas is about to do, I'd probably say, hand me that wire brush over there, and I'll wash some feet here, But Jesus was not that way because he served everyone equally and loved everybody this way. I've told this story, I know, at least 100 times and maybe more. But I like to tell it not just for other people to hear, because I'm not too excited about telling you something that is a bad thing about my life, but I like to remind myself every once in a while about this particular thing, and it helps me as an individual, as a Christian, it helps me in my ministry to think about how I am ministering to others. I hadn't been preaching very long, full-time, up in Bismarck, Illinois, not North Dakota, but in Illinois, which is a little farming town of about 300 people. If you've ever lived in a little town of about 300 people, you know that everybody knows everybody, and that's not a bad thing, and that's pretty well the way it is. Well, it was a good work. Things were going along, and we started out there. That was my first pulpit work. I was really young. We started out about 60, and all of a sudden we were up to about 120, and boy, things were looking so good. But I remember one morning we just had 2 rows of seats that Judy and I were sitting right here, as we always did, in those 2 rows, and still that's kind of the distance that we sit from the front. But I remember that morning hearing something rather unusual, and it wasn't somebody walking in, it was the chins of the people who were there hitting the floor. I think we have an Amber Alert. A what? Oh, blue alert, okay. Okay. So this lady walks in, and I hear all these chins hitting the floor. And I couldn't see her, but when she walked on up and she sat down, then I actually knew who it was, although I never met the lady. Like I say, everybody knows everybody in a small town. And we will be nice enough to just say it like this. This was a lady that somebody had told me one time that was kind of the lady of the evening of that small town. And she came in, not only her, but also her daughter, who was then 18, and from what I've been told, following in her mother's footsteps. Now, they were nicely dressed. They had a Bible with them when they came in. They sat down, and you could tell that when they sang the songs, it didn't matter if it was Amazing Grace or whatever. They didn't know the songs, but they were trying to sing them because I was speaking to see. And when I got up to speak that day, they were taking notes, and I think they were really interested in really knowing what was going on. And so we were trying to call out scriptures, and they were trying to find them. And, they were really engaged in what was going on in that service. When they got up and left that day, and when we dismissed, they came out, and I met them for the first time. And I said, it was good to have you here today. And they left. Now, part of the reason we had grown as a church is that we began to reach out to the community. We were serving. And there were people coming, and when we had visitors, we always made sure that we followed up with a visit, or we sent them a note. There was something that we did to try to encourage them to come back again or to set up a Bible study, whatever the case might be, and that was going very well. But I remember going up to the little hardware store, which was about the only one in town, that next morning, and there were a couple of men that were sitting in there. They were members of the church, older men, and they said, well, Brother Stan, I guess you saw who came in the church yesterday. And I didn't have to guess about that. I knew exactly who they were talking about. I said, well, yes, I did. I said, surely they need to be there, or something to that effect. And they kind of made a little sly remark. But as far as I know, there was nobody that ever sent a card or a note or went by to visit them. And I would have to say I was of that number. But the next Sunday, they came back again. And it was the same scenario. They came in, they sat down, they tried to sing the songs. They were trying to look at the Bible, read all the scriptures. They were taking notes as we were going through. Just a teacher and a preacher's delight. They left that day, and they never came back again. To my shame, I'll tell you that I heard about them about a month later, that they had gone then into the town of Danville, which is about 10 miles away from us, and joined a charismatic church. And it haunts me to this day to think that had we served them like we served others that came into our assembly, that they might be faithful members of the Lord's church today. But you see, we didn't. I didn't. We didn't serve them the way that we should, because we were screening. We were selective. We were choosing those that we really wanted. Although we didn't say it that way, maybe we didn't really think that way, but in practice, that's exactly what was going on. So you and I need to think very carefully about how we serve, and make sure that we serve everyone equally. That's important. So serving becomes a very challenging thing when we think about it's part and parcel to Christianity, when we think about we must serve everyone equally, when we think that that is a part of what we do, not just on Sunday, but Monday through Saturday as well. Serving is a part of our Christian walk. That's number one. Moving from there, I want us to think about some characteristics of a true servant. This is drilling down a little deeper than where I was just now. Drilling down a little deeper. What are some characteristics of a true servant of God? Number one, a true servant thinks about others more than he thinks about himself. You know the passage more than likely, Philippians chapter 2. There we learn that we're to do nothing through strife or vainglory, but in lowliness of mind, we're to esteem others better than ourselves. And then he goes on to say in verse 4 that we are to think about the interests of others even above our own. And then we get to verse 5, and we learn the ultimate servant. It was talking about Jesus, and said, let this mind be in you, which also was in Christ Jesus. And then it explains what it's talking about. We know that Jesus was with the Father. He was the Son. He was with the Father. But he did not consider that something to be held on to. I'm being quite literal with the text here. But rather, he emptied himself into a bondservant and came in the form of men. So Jesus became a servant. And remember that Jesus said in Matthew 20 and verse 28, or Matthew 20, how that he did not come to be served, but he came to serve. And that's the way Jesus did. He served us all the way through when he was here. So we know then that if we think of others more than we think of ourselves, then we're on the right track to thinking how we can be a servant. Because there are always opportunities out there for you and me. Let me just hone that down a little more to how that works out in everyday life. I asked Judy a while back, that's my wife, for those of you who didn't catch that earlier. Ask her, what's something that you think about that someone did somewhere along the line that you consider one of the greatest acts of service that you know? She said, well, without hesitation, it would be this. When we lived in the state of North Carolina, our kids, we've got 3 kids, and they were small. They're all grown and gone with the kids on their own now, but they're all there at home with us. Micah, our daughter, was just a baby, and then that meant the other would have been in the range of 3 and 5, the 2 boys that are older than she. There was a lady by the name of Linda Sane, and I'd like to see Linda. I haven't seen her in a long time. She now worships down at River Chase in Birmingham. But she came up to Judy one day at church, and she said, Judy, you look tired. And Judy said, there's a reason for that. I was tired. And keeping up those kids and chasing them around, you mothers know how that is. She said, Saturday, do you have anything planned? And she said, well, no, I don't think I do. She said, well, Saturday, I'm coming to get your kids. And I want you to rest, take a nap, do whatever you want to do, but I'm going to keep your kids Saturday. And she did. She came, and she took those kids with her. We knew they were in good hands. Judy got to rest and have a little relief from stress of taking care of 3 small kids all day long. And then she brought them back, and they're all still alive. But what I didn't say deliberately is that she also had 4 kids of her own. They were a little bit older, but they all were still at home. There is someone who thinks of others more than they think about themselves. Because she could have said, well, I've got more kids than you do. I get tired too. But she wanted to serve, and she did. You see, it isn't always the big, gigantic things that we do. Sometimes it's the smaller acts of kindness that we can show that make such a difference in the lives of others. And I'm sure there are probably situations that you can remember where people have done something, some small act of kindness, or at least it might have been small to them, but big to you, that you'll never forget because you knew how unselfish they were. And that's exactly what Philippians 2 said about Jesus. He was unselfish in all that he did. Someone once said, you'll never appreciate what Jesus did for us until we learn to appreciate what he gave up to do what he did. There's a lot of wisdom in that statement. Number 2, a real servant is one that is always looking for opportunities to serve. I don't know how you do it. I can tell you how I do it. There may be better ways, but this works pretty well for me. In my morning prayer time, I always pray for opportunity. Now, there are opportunities out there, but I always pray that God, please give me opportunity to serve you today, to show the love of Jesus to somebody this day. And usually there's something along the way that I can say, that was the opportunity. But I realized after I started praying that particular prayer that I was missing opportunities. You know, it's kind of like they say about that spin arrow. Once it's gone, it's gone. And I think, well, I had an opportunity, but I didn't do anything about it. So I amended that prayer to say, God, not only would I pray that you give me opportunity, but help me to see those opportunities as they come along. And then I found out that I need to amend that one more time. And so now I pray, I say, God, give me opportunity. Help me to see those opportunities and give me the courage to seize those opportunities when they present themselves. Sometimes we think, I don't know if I ought to get involved or not. I don't know if that's for me. We just need to have the courage to be a servant every day. When people know your heart and they realize you love them and that you're only trying to serve them, I guarantee you that will translate well in about any situation. So people then that are true servants are people that are looking for opportunity to serve. Next, a true servant looks at opportunities as a privilege to serve rather than an obligation to serve. And there's a big difference in that attitude. People that want to serve, they're considering it's a privilege for me to do this. I want to be able to do something to show Jesus that I love him. I want to do something for his cause. And I see that's an opportunity, but it's not an obligation. Psalm 100 verse 2. Serve the Lord with gladness. You say there's an attitude again. Serve the Lord with gladness. I'm glad that I can do this. But there's more. 1 Peter chapter 4 and verse 9. We learn that we are to be hospitable to one another. And I wish he hadn't put that last part in there. But he said, be hospitable to one another without grumbling. Ooh, when we get to grumbling, it says something about that, maybe my attitude is not right, and maybe I'm looking more as an obligation than I am as an opportunity to be a faithful servant of Jesus. Some of you have heard that little story about the mother one time that these small kids, and she wanted to have several folks over from church on Sunday. So she invited these folks, and anyway, she was excited about it at first, and then she realized what a task that was, not really thinking it through maybe, that on Sunday morning she had to get up and not only get herself ready, but also the kids ready, and then try to get this food ready, and it was quite a task. And just as soon as church is over, she's back home, and she's trying to get everything all done. And so anyway, she's worked up a sweat, and it's been quite an ordeal for her. And then, as they all, she asked her little son, who was just small at the time, son, would you lead us in a prayer? And he said, Mom, I don't know what to say. I'm kind of nervous in front of all these people. She said, well, son, just say what you've heard me say. So he bowed his head and said, Lord, why did I invite all these people over here today? You see, there again, it turned into an obligation, didn't it? But you remember when Jesus and his disciples came to Bethany, and he was invited into the house of Martha and Mary and Lazarus. You remember that Mary was taken by Jesus right away. And she sat down at his feet, and she was listening and hanging on every word, and nothing wrong with that. But Martha, always a server. Every time we see Martha in the Bible, she's always serving. So she's back trying to get lunch ready. But it said that she was distracted with much serving. And it's always kind of struck me that after a while she comes in, she didn't say anything to Mary. She actually talked to Jesus and said, more or less, tell her to get in here and help me because there's work to be done. And remember what Jesus said, Martha, Martha, you're cumbered with much serving. Mary has chosen the better part. Now, I think that Jesus was saying, yes, I'll enjoy the food. Yes, thank you for what you have done. But you have forgotten the opportunity. And you have let the obligation take over. She didn't really serve the way that she should. She started out that way maybe, but the opportunity became an obligation. You and I, as true servants, need to always keep that in mind, that anytime we can serve, it's an opportunity for us to show the love of Christ, show Him that we love Him, show others that Christ lives in us. But when it becomes an obligation, I think it also translates to others that way too. We also need to think about a true servant as one who actually just thinks about his own opportunities and responsibilities. And we don't look at everybody else and what they are or not doing. I realize that I've got to serve the Lord, period. And it doesn't matter what Joe or Jane or anybody else, I've got my responsibility to serve the Lord. Remember 2 Corinthians 10 verse 12? It says there that there were folks who were comparing themselves among themselves, and he said that's not wise. What it will do is you'll start looking around, you think, well, they're not doing as much as I am, that will discourage you. And you might quit. But if you'll remember that I'm not doing this to impress anybody else, I'm not doing this based on what they're doing, I'm doing this because I want to serve the Lord. And when we learn to serve the Lord and we plow our own road rather than thinking about what everybody else is doing, it surely makes all the difference in the world. So, a true servant is one that looks for opportunity, but also is one that's very grateful for the opportunity when it presents itself. There was an article in Reader's Digest several years ago that I always liked, and I had it cut out at one time, and I misplaced it. I'll probably run across it again one day, but I've always really liked it because I think it gets right to the heart of what we're talking about here. The article was titled, I Came to Shine Your Shoes. And let me tell you what happened. This lady that wrote this story talked a very true story about how that they had small kids at home and husband and wife both working, typical of our time. But they learned about a death of a family member that was out of town, and all of a sudden they had to try to pull all the loose ends together and go to a funeral out of town. And they think, oh, we got to contact the school, we got to make things right with work, we got to do this, we got to do that. And she said, I was just in a tizzy trying to get everything done because we had to get out of town pretty quickly. And then there was a knock on the door. She went to the door, and there was a neighbor that she really didn't know, but she knew he was a neighbor. She had seen him before, maybe exchanged a few words at some point. And he had a box in his hand. And he said, ma'am, he said, first of all, let me tell you, I heard about the death in your family, and very sorry. Very sorry. And I came to shine your shoes. And she said, sure enough, in that box, he had a lot of shoe shining equipment. He said, let me tell you, this happened to us a couple of years ago. And he said, we were trying to get things all pulled together so we could go out of town, just like you're doing now. And he said, one thing I remember, he said, we knew it would be going to a funeral, and he said, we had those small kids, and every one of them had shoes that were all scuffed up. And he said, that might be the truth with you. And he said, I came over here to polish your shoes. And said he came in, sat down in the middle of her kitchen floor, and polished not only the kids' shoes, but also the adult shoes that were in the house. And she said, of all the kind things that were done during that time, that is the thing that stands out to me the most. Because he was so unselfish, so serving, so helpful, wanting to do something, which he did, that she never was able to forget. True servants have those kinds of characteristics. But now, in the last couple of minutes that we have here, move on to think about some great examples of service. We've already talked about Jesus a little bit, but we can't talk about this without talking about Jesus. Isn't it amazing to think about the Son of God serving in the way that he did here during his earthly ministry? Not only did he wash feet, but he loved children, and he picked them up and played with them, and he helped those that needed help, and he ministered those that nobody else wanted to touch, and he just showed himself a servant in so many ways. But what I like is it was not always in the temple or always in the synagogue, but it was every day. One of the great statements that I love about Jesus that is made about him is not in Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. It's actually in the book of Acts. In Acts chapter 10 and verse 38, it's said about Jesus that he went about doing good. And I love that statement because that tells me that you and I ought to be that way all the time. Whether we're at work or at school or at play, wherever we are, we can always go about doing good. We can always be a servant wherever we are. Paul was a great servant. In 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 15, he made a statement that is one that we all need to remember when we think about serving. When he tells the church, I'm willing to spend and be spent for your souls. Isn't that a great statement to make? But he didn't just make the statement, he lived it. I'm willing to spend and be spent for your souls. Dr. Todd Chastain is one of our members now there at Killen, and he's a dentist for those of you that might not know. And we know that folks in the medical field, they're often working some strange hours, but as a dentist, not so many of those. And I was talking to him just Sunday, and I said, how's your weekend been? He said, well, it's been pretty good. He said, actually, this afternoon I did get a call, and a good patient of mine, and they were having a problem, and I did have to meet them at the office. But he said, really, other than that, but he said, people think that I have to do that kind of thing all the time. And he said, I really don't, and I was really glad to do that. He said, ministers are that way, aren't they? I said, well, not all the time. I said, yes, I've had those calls in the middle of the night, but it's not every night. And I've had those times when I'm so tired that I just feel like I just want to get in my recliner and stay there for a long time. But somebody will call and they need something. And it doesn't happen every day, but it happens. And when it happens, I have to ask myself, what's more important? saying this in this recliner for the next hour or two, or being a servant to somebody that really needs it. And there's really no two options there. There's really only one. Can you imagine going to Jesus and saying, Jesus, I need, and he said, no, I've been working all day. I just don't have time for you right now. We never imagined something like that. So if we follow in his footsteps, then we're going to be servants too. And that's the way Paul was. And he saw himself as a debtor. In those I am statements in Romans chapter 1, 14, 15, and 16, he begins in verse 14 by saying, I am a debtor. I'm a debtor. And there, that has to do with attitude. It has to do with action. But it's like this. I know we've all struggled with COVID, and some of you probably have had COVID, and we've all probably had some dealings with COVID in the last couple of years. But there's something even worse. How about cancer? Suppose tonight, every one of us, whether we've had it or we know somebody close to us that suffered with cancer, suppose tonight, by some happenstance, do I find something this important, then I realize I have now become a debtor to everyone, because this affects everybody in a very positive way. When it comes to the gospel, isn't that the way it is? It's the greatest thing of all. And unless we have the heart of a servant, who's going to hear what they need to hear? Who's going to understand that there's a Jesus that loves them and died for them and has been raised and wants everyone to? It has been said, as I close here tonight, that a church that will not serve, I would hone that down a little more to say unwilling to serve, you cannot be saved. It's that important. Serving. It's a great thing. It's a great thing because we're blessed by it. Others are, but we're blessed by it too. But most importantly, it pleases our Heavenly Father. Thank you so much.